Chapter 10. Talking to the Creator. Dak had yet to move a muscle from his chair, still transfixed by the fact that Aristotle was standing in front of him, scolding him even. He'd always pictured the first historian as a philosophizing dude who sat around reading books and every once in a while pointing his finger toward the sky and saying something wise. But the man who just ordered the doors to the balcony sealed was a leader, if Dak had ever seen one. A hard, weathered man who'd obviously been around the block a couple of times. Aristotle moved to the right. The guy even walked with a certain air of grandness and grabbed a wooden stool, then brought it around so he could sit in front of the three newcomers. After taking a seat, he still towered over Dak and the others, sitting in low chairs. Something told Dak that the man had done that on purpose. "I wouldn't be here today if I hadn't spent a lifetime trusting my instincts," Aristotle said. "A minute ago, I was ready to throw you out, hoping you'd have been scared enough to never pull such a prank again, hoping your parents would take you back in and do some serious correcting. But you," he nodded his grizzled, bearded head toward Dak, "the things you said, I can't ignore them. Something is going on here that I want to know about, and I want to know about it immediately. So start talking." Rick said nothing. Dak looked at him just in time to see his Adam's apple visibly jump up and down. Sara said nothing. Dak could actually hear her gulp. As for Dak himself, he just wanted to make up for the ridiculous onslaught of nonsense he'd tried sputtering out the first time he spoke, but he couldn't find the words to start. Aristotle took each of them in with another long glance, then shook his head. "I guess no one ever taught the three of you what the word immediately means. Someone speak, or I may call back my soldiers and tell them I was wrong to reprimand them after all." A burst of courage lit up Dak's heart. "I'll go. I'll try to explain why we're here." From his right, he heard Sara let out a relieved breath she'd been holding in her chest. Rick reached around her to pat him on the back and whispered, "Go for it." "Thank you," Aristotle replied. He folded his arms and leaned so far back that Dak thought he might topple off of the stool, but his balance held steady. "I have a feeling you're going to make a bit more sense this time around. You look to be a smart one." Dak smiled a forced, sad little smile. Had the creator of the historians just complimented or insulted him? Both, it seemed. He took a deep breath and did as Rick had told him to. He went for it. "Sir, I promise you I've never said something more important in my life. We need your help, or the future of the world is in serious trouble. I'm talking like lots of people dying and bad guys ruling the world and everybody falling into fiery cracks in the planet's crust as earthquakes destroy the world. That kind of trouble." Aristotle said nothing, which was the best Dak could hope for so far. "This is the hard part," he continued. "I know this is going to sound crazy, and you might get up and order those jerks to come chop my head off, but I don't know what else to do but come out and say it and hope that you will be able to accept it." He paused, and Aristotle's bushy gray eyebrows rose so high they almost collided with his hairline. "We're from the future," Dak finally said, working hard not to let his face squeeze up into a pathetic wince. "Far, far in the future, like more than a couple thousand years. As I'm sure someone as smart as you—" He was losing it. "I mean, from what we know, you're the kind of man who wouldn't be surprised to learn that humanity advances far enough for such a thing to happen someday. Time travel? Am I right?" Aristotle leaned forward, those same eyebrows now crashing down to half cover his eyes. "Boy, I've said before that the high-minded man must care more for the truth than for what people think. And I can tell you that the number of people in this cluster of buildings who would believe you are, well, less numerous than the nostrils on your face. But if anyone will believe, and if anyone will preach it once he does, then you are looking at him now." A huge smile started to form on Dak's face, but Aristotle wiped it away with a quick and sharp look. "If," I said, "if. A word with only 2 letters, but as important as all the words of language combined." Dak, in awe of the man's sage words, could only bring forth a nod. Aristotle turned to Sara. "I think the boy has opened up a floodgate. Let us see if you can channel the waters. Tell me more." Dak looked at his friend, hoping she didn't mess things up. Sara cleared her throat, obviously unprepared for the sudden shift in Aristotle's attention. Well, I can vouch for what he said. We used a time travel device to come here, to meet you, and to warn you about something really bad that's going to happen to—" Aristotle leapt to his feet and held his hands out to silence Sara. "Now wait, please. I'm not sure any of us are ready for such a leap. I believe time to be a fragile thing, as well as the fabric of reality from which it's woven, and it worries me to hear of what may be, or what may not." He sat back down, his face troubled, looking at the floor as if for answers written in the stone. "My teacher of teachers. Years ago, we talked about such things, he and I. I am not sure if he's known in your time." "Plato," Dak blurted out before he could pause to think. "You and Plato will be known throughout history as two of the brightest minds ever. You guys are totally famous." The philosopher relaxed once again, leaning back on his stool. "Like I said, I've always trusted my instinct, and the fact that we still sit here, speaking to one another, means that it has yet to warn me against your words. But—" He trailed off, scratching his beard and looking up into the sky. Dak couldn't let Aristotle make the same choice Lincoln had. If they were going to fix the prime break, they needed the man's help. Dak glanced over at Sara, then at Rick. "You haven't said anything yet. Pipe in and help us out a little." "Yes," Aristotle added, seeming almost hopeful as he focused on Rick. "You appear older than these two. Perhaps we've saved the best for last." Dak felt a prick of jealousy and expected a smug look from Rick. When the older boy didn't throw it at him, Dak decided once and for all that their issues were officially a thing of the past, at least for a few minutes. "Listen," Rick began as he leaned forward and put his elbows on his knees. "This is really hard for all of us, I think. It makes me feel better that you seem so worried about time and messing it up. It shows you get it. But we're here to tell you that things are already messed up with—" He faltered for a second, looking to Dak and Sara for support, then surging ahead. "With your permission, we want to tell you about the future, because we need your help to make things right. You'll just have to trust us that it's okay to talk about, but we won't until you say it's okay." A long moment of silence passed, Aristotle passing his eyes from Rick to Sara to Dak, then starting all over again. And again. Dak could almost see the wheels spinning behind those eyes. "I've made my decision," the man finally said. "I want you to tell me everything you came here to say, and then we shall see where we are, and what may come." Sara and Rick both looked at Dak. It was his moment to shine. Chapter 11. The Python Interrupts Again. And so Dak went at it, spilling everything in a torrent of information that barely left him time to take proper breaths. About the great breaks, Aristotle's belief that they needed to be corrected, his belief in eventual time travel, how the historians came into existence because of his vision, the SQ, everything. After he told the story of the far future and how he and his friends had been sent back in time to set things right and to find his missing parents, he quickly went through the list of the breaks they'd conquered so far. And then it was time for the kicker. The final task. "In 3 weeks," Dak said, "an assassin is going to kill King Philip and his son, Alexander III. The look of complete horror that transformed Aristotle's face made Dak stop before he went any further. The man appeared as if he might cry. His lip trembled, his eyes grew dark, his entire body seemed to shrink. "This can't be," he said, his steady, regal voice cracking for the first time. I taught the boy, practically raised him to the better part, the most important part, of his youth. He's destined to do great, great things. Change the world. I know it in my heart, without any doubt. This can't be."
Dak had expected the philosopher to be troubled, but the reaction went far beyond his wildest expectations. Aristotle looked like a man who'd just been told his son had been killed, which evidently was for all intents and purposes what had happened. The man was visibly traumatized. But then he composed himself, the stately leader and teacher regaining his footing. He stood tall, brushed at his robes, then sat back down again, ramrod straight, looking as if he'd never been bothered at all. Dak's admiration grew.
"Your words ring true," Aristotle said. "And if this truly did, or does, happen, then my reaction is exactly as your historians have taught you. Such a thing would devastate me, indeed, and I'd do anything to reverse that course." He paused. "We've had trouble lately. Strangers appearing, wreaking havoc. Strangers who are nothing like Greeks or Macedonians at all."
Dak and his friends exchanged looks. The dude at the fountain. Tilda was up to something, no doubt.
"It's why my guards have been so vigilant," Aristotle continued. "So vicious. I ordered them to be so. I wasn't about to let anything get in the way of the League and our plans for this great nation and the world."
His eyes found Sara's.
"Can you show me the device? Your words do ring true, but it would be foolish for me not to have the proof of it."
Sara was digging through her satchel before he'd even finished his last sentence. Dak found he couldn't wait for the philosopher to hold a piece of the future right there in his hands. The ring was dented, but shiny, and it glowed with an inner light. Dak knew there could be no doubt such a thing came from a distant future. Aristotle held the device, turning it over and over, studying it with a look of pure wonder.
"Oh, that my master was still here with us," the philosopher said. "If Plato could have seen this, he and I would have spent a year and a day talking over it. I miss the man. I miss him like my own father."
He finally, almost reluctantly, gave it back to Sara.
"Tell me more of what you know about Alexander's death. If the only thing you've come here to ask of me today is to prevent my student from being murdered, well, you could have saved your breath about all the rest. I would do anything for that boy. Oh, he's a man now, I suppose. A man grown, and a great one at that."
A rush of excitement had started to fill Dak's bones. They were on the cusp now, the cusp of finishing what they'd started for the historians. It was right here for the taking. With Aristotle's help, stopping the assassin should be relatively easy. If nothing else, the philosopher could just tell his former student to stay hidden in the wings, to avoid seeing his father for a while. They could do this. They could really do this. Prevent the cataclysm. One look at Sara, and the light in her eyes showed she was thinking the same thing. Rick spoke up. "Like Dak said, it's supposed to happen in about 3 weeks. The assassin, Pausanias, plans to kill King Philip with poison, right there in his big old tent where he and his army are camped, preparing for their huge assault on Asia Minor. The oopsie part is that Alexander will be there on a surprise visit, and Pausanias will end up killing them both."
"Now wait a moment," Aristotle said, leaning forward with a look of worry on his face. "Two concerns. One, Pausanias seems an unlikely man for the job. He's been a loyal bodyguard for Philip for years. He must be manipulated by someone else. And I would wager every minute I ever spent with Plato that Attalus is the man behind the murder. He's been ambitious from day one for his grandson, Caranos, to become the hegemon someday, and it would do him no good unless he killed both Philip and Alexander."
"Which is exactly what happens," Rick rebutted.
"Yes, but you said that Pausanias doesn't know, I should say, that Alexander will be there. If this is about installing Caranos as king, I highly doubt the conspirators would plan the attack unless they knew for sure that both father and son would fall together. I can promise you that they would never have another opportunity after one murder or the other done alone."
Dak was itching, almost literally, to take over from there, but with some spark of kindness dredged up from the bottom of his depths, he let Rick have the fun. "That's the key, sir," Rick said. "According to our history books, everyone agrees with you and thinks that Attalus is behind the murder, but it's a cover-up. The true mastermind is Olympias."
"The boy's mother?"
Aristotle asked in a rage, almost as if he'd been accused himself. Rick nodded, and so did Dak when the philosopher looked at him for confirmation of the shocking news. "She was even more ambitious than Attalus," Sara added. "She wanted Alexander to be king, and she wanted it immediately. She didn't want to wait for Philip to die or be killed. The plan obviously backfires." Dak felt like he had to throw something out there. "As for Pausanias, it's true he is the king's bodyguard, but a lot of people will do anything for the right money, or for power. We've learned that the hard way." Aristotle scratched his beard.
"My heart can scarcely bear it. I love Olympias as well. She is a sweet, sweet woman who thinks the world of her son."
"Sounds like a Shakespeare play," Dak mused. "Mother arranges for her son to be king, but her schemes end up killing him."
"Shakespeare?"
Aristotle repeated. "Never mind." Sara rubbed her hands together. "So, you probably have a lot of influence with Alexander still, right? All we need to do is make sure you keep him away from his father and away from Pausanias." "Yeah," Dak said. "Easy peasy." He wasn't sure that translated too well, because the philosopher's eyes wrinkled up in confusion. But then the man let out a huge breath and leaned back on his stool once again.
"So be it. As I've said, I'll do anything to prevent this murder. I didn't spend all those years teaching Alexander just to have him poisoned by a traitor's hand. I'll have my people contact him first thing in—"
The door to the balcony burst open, slamming against the wall and rebounding to knock a man almost clear off his feet. He had black hair and a studious face, which was now lit with something close to terror. His skin was milky pale. Recovering his composure, only slightly, he more gently pushed the door all the way open, then stared at Aristotle expectantly. The philosopher had stood up, and Dak saw a bit of worry bleeding through the man's normally graceful demeanor.
"Python," Aristotle said, "the last time you so interrupted me upon a balcony, it was for great news. Something tells me the winds blow a different and darker direction today."
The newcomer looked even graver than when he first burst in. "Teacher, I'm afraid I have horrible, horrible tidings." He gave a wary look at the three young strangers sitting in the balcony chairs.
"Don't worry about them," Aristotle urged. "Just spit it out now. What's happened?"
Python's eyes brimmed with tears. "Your former student, Alexander the Third, son of our great hegemon."
"Yes, I know who he is,"
the philosopher snapped.
"Is he in danger?"
Python swallowed, and his eyes fell to the floor. "He's been murdered, killed by a woman with hair of flames and lips of tar." Chapter 12. Predicament. Sara had never felt so stunned by someone's words. She sat in her chair and stared at the man named Python, wondering if she had heard him correctly. More like hoping she hadn't. They were supposed to have 3 weeks to prevent the prime break from happening, and the woman with hair of flames—
"You're certain of this?"
Aristotle asked his servant, after what felt like a very long silence. Python nodded, grim-faced. He obviously didn't enjoy being the one to relay such an awful message. Aristotle slumped back onto his stool, every ounce of blood having drained from his face. Even his beard seemed to sag and wilt, along with the rest of his countenance.
"How certain, Python? I must know."
"They have his body, my master. There can be no doubt."
"Then leave us."
Sara expected the man to be thrilled to get out of there, but impossibly, he looked even sadder. Yes, teacher. Please let me know if there is anything I can do. Python bowed and left, closing the door as he went. He's been so good to me, Aristotle whispered, staring at the stone of the balcony floor. Been with me for so many years. I should treat him with more kindness. It seemed like an odd thing to say, but Sara felt a little disoriented herself. She knew they had a billion things to talk about now, but she couldn't find one word to utter. In fact, no one spoke for a good long while. What are we going to do? Rick finally asked, a simple enough question. The answer, not so much. Need I ask the obvious? Aristotle responded. You came here, told me of an elaborate future wrought with difficulty, and showed me a device that my own eyes are wise enough to tell me is not a ruse. I believe that you three are from another time and place, and yet you sat there and told me the details of a murder that was to happen 3 weeks from now. You've thrown my mind into a cloud of doubt and mistrust, I must say. He looked apologetic as he said it, as if he didn't want to disappoint them. But Sara knew he had every right to think them a bunch of liars now. For all he knew, they were in league with Alexander's murderer. It's Tilda, Dak said. Sara and Rick had been thinking it. What else could they think? But Dak was the first to throw it out there. We all know it. She came back and took care of business herself before we could even have a chance to fix it. I swear I'm going to rip every red hair off that woman's head next time I see her. That'll teach her, Rick muttered under his breath. Tell me of this Tilda, Aristotle said. Tell me everything. For once, Dak didn't seem too eager to spew any information from his overclogged head, but he did so anyway. Tilda is also a time traveler, he said, but she's with the SQ, the bad guys. She wants the breaks to happen because each and every one leads to a future where she's rich and powerful, never mind the consequences. Alexander's death is the event that leads to the creation of the SQ. She made sure it happened before any of us would expect it. She beat us at our own game. And what does that mean for us? Aristotle asked. Sara answered, unable to prevent her mind from picturing the remnants of her parents and thinking how the chance of ever seeing them again, of ever getting to know them, might have just been squandered. It means, despite our best efforts, the fabric of time and reality has just been ripped, torn, broken. Tilda has set off a chain reaction that will one day be too much for physics to handle anymore. And then comes the cataclysm, Dak added. Yep, Sara agreed, sadly. The end of the world. Aristotle was studying them intently as they spoke. But you were able to fix these other breaks, correct? Sara nodded. Then maybe having just one go wrong won't be too much. Maybe... Oh, what am I saying? Right now my heart doesn't care a bit about all of that. I've lost one of the most precious people I've ever known. And then, shocking everyone, Aristotle, the great and majestic philosopher, master of ethics, teacher, scientist, poet, broke down and started bawling, chest hitching with sobs, tears streaming down his face into that famous beard. Sara didn't know what else to do. She got up and pulled the man into a hug. He certainly didn't respond, but he didn't pull away either. The episode lasted for just a minute or two, and then he regained his composure. Sara went back to her chair and sat down, looking at Dak, then Rick. They had to decide what to do, but in everything they'd been through so far, no matter how awful, at least they'd had historians and clues and guides as to what to do next. Not so now. They were at the end of the line, and all bets were off. Like never before, Sara and her friends were totally, completely on their own. You know what we have to do, right? Dak asked. Sara did, but the very thought terrified her. You want to go back in time again, stop Tilda before she can kill Alexander, but it throws all our plans off. How do we know we won't alter history even worse, or set reality up to break 1,000 more times? This is uncharted territory. Yeah, it is, Rick agreed. But what else are we going to do? Say, oh well, and just go back to the future? Hang out on the back porch until our house falls into a river of exploding lava? Sara sighed. Of course not. I'm just saying it's scary and we have no idea what to expect. This isn't a video game we can just reset. Why are you being so negative? Dax shot back. In all the years of their friendship, she thought it might be the first time he'd ever truly hurt her feelings. She felt his words like a dagger. We all know there's no choice here. Alexander is dead, and Aristotle told us, he eyed the philosopher with a you-know-what-I-mean glance, that his dying is the first break, the prime break, the break that started it all. So nothing else matters. There's no decision to make. We go back and we save him. Boom, that's it. Sara wanted to strangle him for sounding so arrogant. The only problem was that her best friend was totally right. What else could they do? Well, Dak pushed. Quit acting like you just found the cure for cancer, Rick muttered. We all know that's what we have to do. Sara nodded, refusing to let her pride get in the way. She knew that part of her problem was worrying about her parents and the remnants. It scared her to death to stray from the plan that had seemed to be leading her to an actual reunion with them in the future. But she was being stupid. If the historians were right, then Alexander's death presented a much bigger problem. It had to be undone, no matter what the cost. Dak seemed to sense he'd been a little forceful. What do you think we should do, Sara? Go back. Stop Tilda. You're right. There, she said it. And the way he nodded in response saved her from any more wounded pride. Rick clapped his hands once, loudly, then stood up. Then let's get on it. Aristotle rose as well, very slowly, looking back and forth between the other three with a very uncertain expression. Are we sure about this? Sara and her two friends nodded immediately. The philosopher straightened and appeared much more confident. Then I'm going with you, and I don't want to hear any argument about it. I'm going, and that's that. Dak blew a loud breath through his lips. Why would we argue? We need your help, dude. The translator didn't like that last word so much. It sounded more like a burp. Aristotle started walking toward the balcony door. We'll find out everything we need to know from Python. And then off we go. I just hope that toy of yours actually works. If Dak could have chosen anyone to go on a time-traveling adventure with, it was a no-brainer that it'd be Abraham Lincoln. But Aristotle was a pretty good second choice. After talking to Python for an hour or so and learning everything they possibly could about the details of what had happened, Dak, Sara, Rick, and the philosopher were ready to go back in time. They decided on 3 days to be safe and stop Tilda, the lady with hair of flames and lips of tar. It made Dak think of Medusa, who was almost as bad as Tilda. They stood on a patch of dirt behind the official stables of the League of Corinth. The sun had started to set in the west, and Aristotle said that he highly doubted there'd be anyone around. In the waning light of day, the philosopher stared at the infinity ring as Sara pulled it out. I've programmed in the time and the location, she said. Olympias's palace, Dak thought. The home of Alexander and his mom. Back when this had all begun, if he'd made a list of 1 million places they might have to visit throughout history, that one probably wouldn't have made the list. Is this going to hurt? The philosopher asked, as he put his hand on the cool metal of the ring. No, Sara answered simply. Dak didn't know if that was the most honest answer ever, but it seemed to make their famous friend feel better. They stood in a circle, the sky above them fading from orange to purple, 4 right hands clinging to the infinity ring in the middle of their group. Sara ignited the device into action, and sparkles of light flashed in the air. Just before they were swept away, something happened that made Dak's stomach almost leap through his throat and out of his mouth. About 20 feet away from where they stood, 4 people suddenly appeared, almost as if they were falling out of the sky, their images flashing into existence just long enough for Dak to see who they were. Himself, Sara, and a man and woman he'd never seen before. It was only for an instant, but enough for Dak's mind to explode with confusion. He was staring at himself, and the other version of him looked back with an odd expression of understanding. It was unnerving, confusing, and Dak didn't like it one bit. Then the sky ripped open and sucked them into the oblivion of a wormhole. Chapter 13. The Gardens of Olympias. Rick couldn't believe what he'd just seen. It happened so quickly, he thought that he had to have imagined it, that he was seeing things in the moment before they were sucked into the wormhole. He didn't love the feeling of his body being pulled and stretched and compressed by a billion forces all at once, but at least he'd grown somewhat used to it, not to mention the sounds and the lights and the wind that wasn't really a wind. But he couldn't help but feel sorry for Aristotle, who wasn't exactly young and spry, as they traveled through the space-time continuum. Like always, Rick had a hard time comprehending just how long it took for them to make the leap. Only moving 3 days, you'd think it would be a quicker warp than usual. But it didn't always seem to work that way. Regardless, there was the mind-numbing intensity of it all, the world exploding and contracting and streaking all around him. And then it was over. He tumbled onto a bed of short-cut grass, then slammed into a big green hedge with prickly leaves. The whole thing shook above him, as if it were laughing. Dak's foot smacked him in the face, and he heard Sara asking Aristotle if he was okay. The man coughed, then groaned, then laughed. He actually laughed. Rick got to his feet and brushed himself off, relieved to see the great philosopher doing the same thing, all in one piece and with no obvious injuries. The man looked as excited as a kid at a birthday party, practically floating.
"Oh, if Plato could see me now!"
he yelled, obviously forgetting that they were supposed to be on a stealthy mission to save his former student.
"Aristotle, traveler of time!"
Rick was pretty sure he'd never seen anything quite so ridiculous as the great philosopher dancing on his toes and making such a pronouncement. Sara was smiling, and Rick instantly knew that she hadn't seen what he'd seen. Dak couldn't have looked any more opposite from her. Troubled and confused, which meant that he had seen it. Dak and Sara's duplicates, and 2 strangers, and no Rick. What exactly did that mean? "I hate to dampen the party atmosphere," Rick said, "but we have to stop Tilda, and I think Dak and I saw something that you guys didn't." He went on to describe what he'd seen. Dak's face was pale. Seeing himself had obviously shaken him up a bit. It was weird. Rick had to admit that, although the kid didn't have his language expertise, that summed it up perfectly. Sara didn't even bother with the standard doubtful comebacks. "Who do you think the man and woman were?" she asked.
"Explain what they looked like," Aristotle added. His elation from a moment earlier popped like a balloon.
It had only been an instant, but Rick could still see them in his mind. The man had brown hair, tall. The lady had black hair, green eyes, thin face, some kind of weird jewel on a necklace around her neck. "Was it an amethyst?" the philosopher asked. No idea." Rick was a translator, not a geologist. "But I think it was purple." Aristotle shrugged, a comical thing to see on such a great man.
"An amethyst, then. The woman you saw was Olympias, Alexander's mother. In fact, we may be meeting her any second now."
His eyes focused on something behind Rick's shoulder. Rick turned around and finally got a good glimpse of the space beyond the giant hedge he'd plowed into upon arrival. Before them lay a vast expanse of gardens, green grass and bushes and flowers and fountains and trees, all arranged in a maze of sorts that reminded him of something out of a fantasy novel. Beyond that, there stood a massive house, built in the Greek style, with pillars and frescoes and friezes. Small statues lined the walkway that led from the main fountain to the stairs below the back entrance to the palace. Palace. That's definitely the right word, Rick thought. Alexander had some sweet digs.
"Philip is a rich man,"
Aristotle said,
looking on with the rest of them at the grand structure. Let's just say this is his way of keeping his former wife happy. Dak started to say something, but before he could even get one word out, a door burst open on the side of the palace, and 3 men came charging out with swords in their hands. 3 huge, vicious black dogs, barking and growling, followed on their heels, and then one of the guards shouted, his voice a boom of thunder, "There they are! Appeared out of nowhere! Sick 'em, hounds! Sick 'em!" Dak had always thought dogs were cute. These things weren't dogs. These things were big, hungry monsters that wanted to eat him alive, and with his luck, he would probably be the tastiest of his friends. "Aristotle!" he yelled. "Tell them who we are." He'd expected to fight Tilda, but not the people they'd come to save from her. The philosopher appeared to think for a second about shouting at the men with the swords, but then gave up. Those nasty dogs were charging in way too fast. "I think at times like this it may be wisest to run," he said. Even on the cusp of death by slobbery fangs, the dude sounded like a philosopher. "Run!" Dak yelled, getting to the point a lot more quickly. But then he saw that Rick and Sara had already done that, heading for an area with a bunch of those tall hedges, maybe thinking they could find a place to hide. Aristotle took off after them, lifting his robes like a lady in a dress, tiptoeing through a mud puddle. He was fast for an older guy. Dak took a step to go in the same direction, but then the dogs were on him, seeming like they'd leapt ahead at an impossible speed. The beasts got between Dak and the rest of his friends, and to his chagrin, they all decided they wanted to focus on the history nerd. For some reason, the words "sweetmeat" ran through his head as he froze, staring at the hideous, slavering monsters who stared right back at him, their thick throats vibrating with deep growls. "Nice pups," Dak said, slowly backing away. They inched forward, matching his movement, telling him with their eyes that he'd better stay put if he wanted to live another 5 minutes. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see that the guards themselves were sprinting through the gardens, almost on him. Dak held his hands up to the sky as if someone had a gun pointed at him. "I'm a good guy," he yelled. "I'm here to save—" The dogs didn't like him talking. All 3 of them jumped forward, jaws snapping. A horrible shriek escaped Dak's throat as adrenaline exploded inside of him. He dove to his left and rolled, barely avoiding the teeth of the lead dog. Then he was on his feet, scrambling around the corner of the original hedge they'd all rolled into when the infinity ring warped them there. The howls and barks of the dogs sounded behind him, and he swore he could feel their breaths on the back of his neck. Dak ran as hard as he could, knowing that he had 0 chance of outrunning the drooling monsters. He rounded another corner and saw a big stone dais that had a statue of Plato standing on top of it. It was his only chance. He jumped onto a small square ledge at the bottom, then vaulted himself onto the dais itself. One of the dogs got the bottom of his robe in its mouth, but Dak was able to rip it free, then climb a little higher onto Plato, who didn't seem to mind too much. Dak was just high enough to stay alive. Below him, the dogs leapt and barked and snapped those sharp teeth at him. "Nice pups," Dak repeated, feeling about as ridiculous as he ever had before in his life. He wondered for a moment whether these beasts might be the ancestors of his old friend, Vigi. Just then, one of the soldiers arrived. The others must have pursued Aristotle and his friends. The man was young, only 19 or 20 by the look of it. Dark, curly hair covered his head, and eyes of steel, one blue and one brown, looked on Dak with anger. The guy had a breastplate that gleamed, and huge muscles in all the right places. One tough dude. "I swear I'm a good guy," Dak pleaded, his arms getting tired from clinging to the statue. "I bet you are," the guard responded. He hefted his bright, shiny, sharp sword and pointed it at Dak. "But I'll never become Alexander the Great if I believe the lies of my enemies." Dak's jaw dropped even as the man he was supposed to save stepped forward to kill him. Chapter 14. A Golden Throne. Sara walked briskly beside Aristotle, Rick, and 2 of the 3 guards who'd come bursting out of the house with the dogs. It hadn't taken long for the philosopher to convince them that they meant no harm, but they still had a problem. There was no sign of Dak, and no sign of the dogs,
who'd looked awfully hungry when they'd chased him through the gardens. "I hope Dak isn't dog food," Rick muttered as they searched the hedges for their friend. Sara smacked him on the arm. "Not funny." "It's kind of funny," he responded. When she gave him a look of death, he laughed. "Don't worry. Do you really think they just let their dogs kill a young boy playing in the yard? I'm sure he's—" He stopped when they turned a corner of towering hedges and saw the scene before them. If Rick had thought things were funny before, now they might seem hilarious, though Sara just felt a swelling of relief. Dak hung on a statue of a man, his hands gripping the arms and his legs wrapped around the torso. The dogs were at the base of the dais on which the statue stood, barking and chomping, slobber flinging in all directions. And then there was a soldier, tall and strong, holding a sword so that its tip rested right under Dak's chin. But the guard was grinning, and it was obvious he had no intention of actually cutting the boy's throat. The young man was probably just trying to teach a lesson and maybe enjoying it a little too much. "Alex," Aristotle said in a commanding voice, "put down that sword this instant, and call off these bloodthirsty dogs before someone gets a foot bitten off." Rick snickered beside Sara, and instead of smacking him this time, she joined in, hoping Dak didn't notice her laughing. One of the other guards went up and barked some orders at the dogs. He actually sounded a lot like them, and they suddenly ran off, not seeming so violent anymore. Alex, and Sara could only assume that this was the person they'd come over 2,000 years into the past to save, stepped back and lowered his sword, a huge smile spreading across his handsome face. Dark curls bounced as he swung his head to see his former tutor. "Master," he said, "you should really send word before you come to visit Mother and me." His initial glee was dampened a bit by a dark look. "I also trust you'll have an explanation as to why you appeared out of nowhere in the gardens behind our home." Aristotle walked forward and gave Alexander a big hug. "Of course, my boy, of course. We'll explain everything." He took a step back, his hands still gripping the shoulders of his student. "But I just can't tell you how happy I am to see you alive and well. My heart is soaring." Sara understood why he was showing so much emotion. Just an hour earlier, he'd been told his most famous pupil had been killed. And yet here he stood now, safe and sound. Alexander himself, of course, didn't quite get it. "I just visited with you a month ago, and there's not much around here that could hurt me besides some garden tools. Save your worries, master, for the day I go to battle with my father, the hegemon." When he spoke, Alexander had a grandness about him that impressed Sara. Even though he looked young, there was just something majestic about him. Excuse me?" Sara and everyone else looked at Dak, still hanging from the statue. "The dogs are gone," Rick said. "Is there a reason you're still hanging up there like an ugly tree ornament?" "Yes, actually. It was easy to get up here with dogs trying to bite me, but I'm not sure how to get back down. And as much as I love Play-Doh—" Rick and Sara stepped forward and provided footholds and balance as Dak climbed to the ground. Then the boy smoothed his clothes and heaved a big sigh. "Tough work running from man-eating beasts," he said. "You guys should try it sometime." They all stood silent for a moment, awkwardness hanging in the air like drapes. Then Aristotle finally broke the ice. "Introductions," he exclaimed a little too excitedly. He cleared his throat, then proceeded to tell who was who, and, of course, Dak shook Alexander's hand when it came to be his turn. "I've always wanted to meet you," Dak said, "even though I didn't honestly know a lot about you until this—" "Very good, very good," Aristotle interrupted. "Now that we're all friends, let us retire to the palace and get comfortable. Alex, I don't think I need to tell you that there's a lot to talk about." The young man nodded, then finally sheathed his sword. "Yes, sounds like a fine plan, master, but I must warn you." "About what?" the philosopher prodded. Alexander took a second to look at the people he'd just met. "I don't think my mother is going to be very happy to see you." As pretty as the outside of Olympias's palace was, The inside took Sara's breath away. Alexander's mother, or her decorator, had an obvious taste for the international. There was pottery from Egypt, rugs from Persia, bronze statues from Italy, furniture of all sizes and shapes, not one piece looking like it came from the same place as another. Sara wished she could transport the entire house into the future. She'd love to live in a place with so much variety and personality. As for Olympias herself, she was as glamorous and beautiful as her palace. Black hair hung to her waist, with ribbons and chains of silver and gold interwoven in intricate designs throughout. Her gown seemed to glow, white and shiny, which brought out her flawless olive skin and blazing green eyes. The amethyst, mentioned earlier, hung in the hollow of her neck. She even had perfect teeth, and Sara had the thought that it should be against some universal law for people to look so good. "I did not invite you here," she said to Aristotle after Alexander introduced them all to her. They were sitting in some kind of fancy parlor, with cushion-laden wooden furniture and colorful tapestries hanging on the walls. One huge window let in a burst of golden sunlight. Olympias was the only one standing, towering like the statue of Plato outside. "No, you did not," Aristotle said, surprisingly firm after the diss. "But I assure you we have vital reasons for being here. We only need a few moments of your time to explain." Not so much as a muscle twitched on the face of Olympias. "Time that I do not have." The philosopher finally stood to put himself on the same level as their hostess. "I would expect better treatment after all I've done for your son, my lady. I've come to learn of a threat that poses great danger to that very boy." He glanced at Alexander, who sat quietly in a chair located in the corner of the room. He seemed to be analyzing every word, every movement, content to wait for more information. "I highly recommend you take a seat and hear us out." Olympias eyed the man, not moving for what seemed to Sara like a full hour. But then she finally smiled, acting as if she'd been doing so since the moment they met. After a brief nod of her head, she took a seat in the biggest chair in the room, one that was draped in silk and appeared to be made out of solid gold. She looked for all the world like a queen on her throne. "Very well," she said in a stately manner. Then her eyes found a spot on a couch, right next to Sara. "Please, sit." Somehow, she'd turned things around to make Aristotle seem like the obstinate one. But the philosopher was unfazed. He plopped down ungracefully and started talking. "We've uncovered an assassination plot." For the first time, the lady's demeanor broke a little. Eyes widened in shock, a little tremor in her mouth. And Sara knew why. She probably thought Aristotle was talking about her plan to have King Philip murdered, but she recovered and waited to hear more. "Someone wants your son dead, Olympias," Aristotle continued. "And I can't tell you why or how we know, but we do. And we know that she is coming here to do it. We must work together to prevent it from happening." "And why should I believe you?" Olympias responded. Sara wanted to growl like the dogs earlier. She really didn't like this woman. "Because you trusted me for years to tutor your son and raise him in the ways of wisdom and light. If you doubt me or refuse to protect him, then I'd have to conclude that you have your own ill tidings planned for the very near future." The tension in the room was strung as tightly as a piano wire. Sara held her breath. Olympias waited. And waited. And waited. She had the patience of a crocodile. Finally, she answered, and Sara didn't know if she would ever breathe again when she heard the words. "You must be talking about my new friend, the woman named Tilda." Chapter 15. Lesson Learned. Dak wanted to stand up, scream and yell, demand answers, but he was so stunned by what Olympias had said that he just sat there, staring at her. The others reacted the same. Alexander's mother knew she'd gotten them good. She told me this might happen, Olympias continued when no one questioned her statement. We've been meeting at the market, and she's become a very good friend. She's so different, with that red hair that shines in the sun like fired iron. I can hardly wait for our meetings. In fact, I've invited her to come and meet Alexander soon. It's not often I allow guests into my home.
Dak closed his eyes for a second and shook his head. What in the world was going on here? Alexander spoke next from his chair in the corner. Would someone please explain this nonsense? My teacher says that someone plans to kill me, and then my mother says her new market friend told her this would happen. Explain. Dak looked at him in awe. The heir to the hegemon sat with his ankles casually crossed, leaning back, and yet he radiated a sense of command. It even seemed to affect his mom. She stammered a bit, and then did her best to answer. Tilda is a wonderful, sweet, compassionate person, my son. She told me the entire story of how these children, she gave a very nasty glare to each one of them, had escaped their homes and fled to our land, bent on causing trouble. I won't bore you with the details, but suffice it to say that they have a vendetta against my beautiful friend, and she told me they'd come here, saying wicked things about her. Her wisdom and foresight is evident. Dak couldn't take another second of this ridiculousness. She's brainwashed you. That's what she does. All nice and sweet until she stabs you in the back. Ever think there's an actual reason we'd come here to say bad things about her? If she's so perfect, why would she have to warn you that we warn you about her? Dak groaned. He was sounding like an idiot. Sara seemed to agree, shooting him her special look. What my friend's trying to say is that this woman, Tilda, is really good at convincing people to do what she says. She's the leader of a group that's very evil. It was her turn to groan. Dak hid his smile. At least he wasn't alone on the idiot train. Olympias stood, folded her arms, and took a few steps forward. I think I've lived long enough, seen enough, met enough people to be able to take care of myself. I know when a soul is good and when a soul is... What was the word you used? She looked at Sara. Evil, I believe. Yes, I know. Trust me. I know very well. She trailed off with that last part, her gaze going distant, and Dak knew she was thinking of King Philip, the man who'd broken her heart and stood in the way of her son's ascendance. Olympias, please. Aristotle used a soft voice. Please listen to us. Please trust us. I spent a good part of my life teaching your son, preparing him for a great future. I couldn't bear it if he were to lose his life. Alex is in danger, and I firmly believe that it's all because of this woman, this Tilda. I'll be the judge of that, she responded. I'm well protected anyway. When she comes here, if I sense any— Mother! Alexander shouted. He jolted from his chair and practically charged to where she stood. Dak thought for a split second he might tackle her, like a rogue linebacker. But he stopped in front of her and grabbed her by the shoulders. Did you tell this woman where we live? Where our home is? Did you? Olympias appeared shocked by the outburst, eyes wide, leaning back from her son. She finally nodded timidly, and Dak wondered if maybe she was snapping out of her brainwashed delusion of Tilda. Alexander pulled her into a hug, then kissed her on the cheek. I love you, Mama. But I would fall backward off the tallest ship into a sea of sharks if my teacher told me to. I trust him with my life, heart, and soul. You should not have done this thing. You shouldn't have told her where we live. You trust him more than me? She replied, her expression showing pure heartbreak. It's not the Olympiad. It's not a race. I trust you both. Besides the sweet, glorious glee of hearing Alexander actually mention the Olympics, which originated in his country long before they renewed it in the modern day, Dak felt unsettled. Things just didn't seem to be going well, or the way he expected. Tilda was too smart. He noticed Aristotle was looking at him. Any suggestions? The man asked him.
Dak wished he had that moment on video. Aristotle asking him for advice. I say we lock Alexander in a closet and have his guards and dogs right outside the door for a week. It never happened, but Dak didn't know how else to make sure, absolutely sure, that Tilda couldn't get to him. Alex pulled out his sword and pointed it at Dak. Remember the lesson you were supposed to learn on that statue? Do I look like the kind of person who'd allow someone to lock me in a closet? Dak shook his head, liking this guy more by the minute. That's a good student. He sheathed his sword. Now come. We're going to the market to hunt down this woman that everyone seems to think wants me dead. She has her own lesson to learn. Without waiting for a response, as if he expected any human who'd ever crossed his path in life to obey his commands without question, Alexander walked out of the room. Dak followed happily at his heels. Chapter 16. Visitor. Rick fell in line with everyone else as they marched through the grand halls of the palace and out the front door, finally walking down huge marble steps onto a wide lawn. It spread out like a green sea before them, and Alexander didn't hesitate a second as he stomped onto it and kept moving, his muscles clenched as if he wanted to run instead. The two guards who'd accompanied him earlier had appeared, hurrying to get right behind him. Then came Aristotle, walking with confident strides. Next was Olympias, having lost every ounce of the stately, towering demeanor she'd shown earlier. After them, Rick, Sara, and Dak tried to keep up, side by side, Sara in the middle. Rick leaned in toward her. You think she'll be there? I don't know, Sara said with a shrug. But since we've probably already altered what she originally intended to do, we need to stay close to Alexander. Dak made a scoffing sound. Like we can do anything to protect him. Look at that dude. He could take down 3 bears with his pinky. Did you lose your brain somewhere? Sara responded. We just found out that Tilda killed him. Yeah, but she probably sneaked up on him or something. Now that we warned him, I bet he'll be fine. Man, for all we know, we've already fixed the prime break. Holy cow, what if that's true? Rick had only been half listening, seeing movement up ahead, beyond where the huge lawn met a road. A group of people, maybe. But what Dak said really struck him. The kid could be right. Totally right. His heart lifted a little. Then he got a better glimpse of what lay ahead. Who are those guys up there? He asked. There seemed to be 20 or 30 people, and they just left the road and walked onto the vast lawn surrounding Olympias's palace. I don't know, Sara responded. But they don't? Her voice trailed off, and she stopped walking. So did Rick. What? He asked. But the word had barely left his mouth when he saw exactly what. Behind the others, coming toward them, at a brisk pace, body language screaming that they weren't on a nice casual stroll, a woman strode along, mostly hidden from view because she was shorter than the others. But every once in a while, Rick caught a glimpse of flaming red hair. Wait! Dak called out to Alexander and the guards. Aristotle and Olympias had already stopped. Tilda's up there! Alex turned around, not a trace of sweat or deep breathing to show that he'd practically been running down the lawn. He looked at his teacher. That's the woman you came to warn me about? Then his eyes moved to his mom. That's your new friend from the market? Both of them simply nodded. Alexander pulled the sword from its sheath, and his two guards followed his lead. The scrape of metal sliding against hard leather rang through the air like bird song. And your friend needed an escort of 20 soldiers to come say hello? Alex asked. Rick was watching the oncoming crowd, and the heir to the hegemon was right. Those marching toward them, protecting Tilda in a semicircle as they walked, were dressed and armed just like Alex and his guards. The glint of breastplates and helms and drawn daggers, swords and spears sparkled in the sunlight, some of the flashes almost blinding. Olympias had gone totally pale, every bit of her seeming like she'd aged 10 years in a minute. her eyes hard with worry. "I don't understand. Things have gotten so complicated." It doesn't matter, Rick thought. They were here, and Rick and his friends were ridiculously outnumbered. The front line of soldiers stopped about 30 feet from where Alexander stood, but Tilda kept walking until she slipped past the armed men and finally stood where Rick could see her, head to toe. Below that fiery hair, her black lips made the rest of her skin look ghostly white. She wore tight-fitting clothes, blood red and charcoal gray, that looked totally out of place compared to everyone else. Her face bore no expression whatsoever. In her right hand, she gripped an infinity-shaped device made out of gleaming metal. The Eternity Ring. "Hello, Olympias," Tilda said, her voice so soft and smooth that it almost convinced Rick she was genuine. For a split second, he felt the outrageous urge to hear her out. There was something magnetic about her, like the woman had evil spells to hypnotize and manipulate whomever she wanted. "It's good to see you again so soon. Thanks again for the invitation to visit your beautiful home. I can tell it's quite the keeper." "You always bring along a bunch of hired thugs for friendly get-togethers?" Rick asked, his heart rate ticking up. He was surprised that Tilda appeared to have a translation device as advanced as that of the historians. The SQ probably stole that technology from them, too. Tilda was shaking her head, taking looks back at the soldiers she'd brought with her. "I'm done taking chances, as you can see. This isn't the first time I've come back in time to do the job that the SQ needs to be done." She faltered a bit on the last couple of words, almost slurring them, and took a step to the left as if she'd suddenly lost her balance. "I hired every sword I could find in the city and came to meet you here, exactly where I knew you would be." She pointed somewhere over Rick's shoulder, and he turned to look. About 50 feet away, a woman was standing beside a tree, staring at them. Impossibly, it was Tilda, another version of Tilda, holding the Eternity Ring. A couple of seconds later, she activated the device and warped away in a blur of light and sound. Everyone gasped in surprise. Rick spun around and shouted at the Tilda who was still there. "Are you crazy?" "You can't mess with time like that," Sara added. "No wonder you can barely stand. Jumping around with the ring like that is going to fry your brain, not to mention do who knows what to reality itself." Dak was still staring back at the spot where the other Tilda had disappeared. Aristotle, Olympias, Alexander, even Tilda's own allies, just stood there, wondering what in the heck was going on. Tilda stumbled again, but then moved a few steps forward, as if she'd meant to do it. "Say what you want. Pretend to have all the high and mighty ideals you want. But I'm telling you, the historians do not understand what's at stake. We can all fight here and lose a lot of lives in the process, but if you would just listen to me." Her face scrunched up in genuine frustration, and Rick found a small part of himself wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt again. "I don't know you," Aristotle said, his voice deeper and holding more resonance than Rick had heard in him yet. "And I don't know the smallest part of what lies in the future or the extent of this battle between your SQ and the historians. But I do know that talking things through, trying to come to an understanding, might be our wisest course of action for right now." "Maybe because we're outnumbered 3-1, Rick thought darkly. Tilda took a few steps forward, and her focus was on Dak, Sara, and Rick, not the others in the group. "I know you think we've done bad things, horrible things, but I'm telling you, we're not idiots. We're not evil. In fact, I know something that you don't, that none of the historians know." "And what's that?" Rick asked. Tilda answered quietly, her face a mask of stone. "How to stop the cataclysm." Chapter 17. Council of Friends. Sara felt a tingle in her temples, as if there were static electricity prickling her skin. She had encountered Tilda before, and it was never a pleasant experience. But this time felt different. Tilda herself seemed different, desperate, Sara couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was more dangerous than ever. "You have no idea how to stop the cataclysm," Dax said. "The SQ boneheads are the ones who've been trying to make sure it happens." The volume of his voice had risen with every word. Tilda laughed as if she'd heard something horrible, not funny. When she did, she also winced like something hurt. Sara understood. Too much warping through time, and your body started to feel like it had been stretched on a medieval torture device. "Make sure it happens," the woman said after she recovered. "You kids are supposed to be smart. You have to be, or the historians would never have let you go back in time to fix their so-called great breaks." She paused, taking a second to look all three of them in the eyes. Alexander and everyone else seemed content to observe for the moment. "You are intelligent, right? Or am I wrong?" "Of course we're smart," Sara snapped. "What's your point?" Tilda held up a finger. This is my point. Why on earth would we spend our entire effort sacrificing lives and time and immense amounts of money to run an organization that wants the world to end? What would be the point? If we want to rule humanity, don't you think we'd want there to be a place for them to live? It's insane to think we want the cataclysm to happen. It's outrageous, and most definitely not intelligent. Sara wanted to say something, rebuke her somehow, but any potential words froze on her tongue. As much as she hated to admit it, the woman had made a good point. Tilda seemed to sense a victory in their silence. "Our ways have been tough. I'll be the first to admit it. We've been harsh because we have to be. Yes, we've ruled with an iron fist, and we've done everything in our power to make sure this man," she tipped her head toward Aristotle, "didn't fulfill his plan to mess up the world, to drive it toward the very cataclysm that you think you're preventing." She paused and pinched the bridge of her nose as she took a deep breath. "Time and space are fine. The fabric of reality is fine. What you're doing, messing with the past, trying to change major events, that's the thing that will drive us to destruction. This young man—" Tilda paused and turned a sad gaze on Alexander. "He dies. He must die. For the good of the world. Whether by Pausanias's hand or my own. I'm here to convince you to let that happen. With words, if possible. If not—" She didn't need to say the rest. Sara swallowed, feeling uncertain about their mission for the first time. Aristotle was the founder of the whole order of historians, but was it possible that he'd created the organization for selfish reasons? That he simply couldn't bear to see his favorite student killed? That it wasn't about the fabric of time, but about a soft-hearted man who wanted to save a boy who could have been great? Sara hated it, hated this wave of doubt. "But why all the natural disasters?" she asked Tilda. "You've seen the state of the world. Plus, I went to the future and I saw the cataclysm for myself, in a world that the SQ has been running, by the way." "Exactly," the woman replied. "You saw it. You went to the future after correcting some of the historians' so-called breaks. You saw a catastrophic future that you created. Again, you're smart. Think about these things, and you'll see that I'm right." Aristotle turned away from Tilda and walked to stand with Sara and her friends. Alexander, his guards, and Olympius did, as well. They stood in a circle, their job now to decide the fate of the entire world, maybe the universe. No biggie, Sara thought. "I don't trust this woman," Alexander said. He still held his sword, as if he wanted to strike the first person to disagree with him. "Amen," Dak added. "I don't trust that lady any farther than Rick can throw Sara." Rick's face wrinkled up in confusion for a second, but then he just shrugged. "She's a trickster. Whatever she says we should do, I'm doing the opposite." Sara looked at Olympius, but the woman was silent, deep in thought. Aristotle scratched his long beard and sighed heavily. Then he spoke. "This woman believes what she's saying. Of that I have no doubt, but there's also a darkness about her.
Not to mention the simple fact that she marched 20 armed men down here to kill the boy I spent years training to be a great king someday, and I feel the goodness in each of you." He stepped forward and took a second to touch Dak, Sara, then Rick on the shoulder. "I don't even see a question, to be honest," the philosopher said. "There's no way in Hades or the halls of Zeus that I'll let that woman take the life of Alexander."
"He is the son of Zeus," Olympias whispered distantly.
"I don't need your help," the young heir said, his eyes slightly moist. "But I appreciate the offer." Fear crawled like a caterpillar up Sara's spine. They only had 3 soldiers, and Tilda had 20.
"What are you thinking?"
Dak whispered to her. She shrugged.
"I just don't know what we're going to do."
Dak turned to Alexander.
"Can you call more of your friends? It looks like we have pretty bad odds."
Alex spun the sword in his hand. "Today you will learn the greatness of Alexander," was all he said. But it came out sounding like something that should be engraved on a plaque. The young man turned toward Tilda and stepped away from the circle of friends they'd formed, heading straight toward the woman. "My lady," he yelled out, "we have counseled with my teacher and master, the wisest man who has ever graced this world, and our decision was an easy one. We reject your foul proposal and order you to leave the lands of my mother, Olympias of Epirus, daughter of King Neoptolemus. Leave, or the punishment will be severe."
"So be it."
Tilda nodded, then took slow and steady steps backward, her eyes never leaving Alexander. The soldiers she'd hired parted to let her pass, and soon all of them were once again in front of her, a shield of armed and angry men.
"Kill them,"
she said, as calmly as the most seasoned battle commander.
"But Tilda!"
Olympia screamed, finally coming alive.
"You were my friend! We were like sisters!"
Tilda frowned.
"Be sure and kill her, too."